What do you do with ships when they're damaged beyond repair? Do you scrap them or use their parts to repair other ships? This was a question for the Royal Navy in late 1916. Two of their tribal-class destroyers, not those tribals, had suffered severe damage. HMS Nubian had lost her bow, and HMS Zulu lost her stern. In any other situation, these ships were fit for nothing more than the scrapyard, maybe serving as a station ship like HMS Porcupine decades later. But this was 1916. The British needed every ship they could get. So they took a long and hard look at the situation. Two relatively new destroyers, each missing one end of the ship. And some bright spark went, aha, we can use this. Or alternatively, well, they're sister ships, right? Regardless, Nubian and Zulu were put in dock where the damaged bits were cut off, and the two halves were made one in what's best described as Frankenstein Ship. Not the only time this would happen, but certainly the most famous. The result would be HMS Zubian, a typically British play on words, combining the names as they combined the ships. It also confused the Germans to no end. But how did we get to this point? Well, for that we need to look at Nubian and Zulu first, if only briefly. Also, if you're a long-time viewer, you might remember me covering this ship before. That was, however, a very early video. Much as I did with Espero and Etzel, I want to go into more detail. Thus, this 2.0 video. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. This is a story that began with changes in technology. The first tribal-class destroyers developed around the same time as HMS Dreadnought. These ships were a similar jump in technology, at least in terms of propulsion. Previous torpedo boats and destroyers had used coal-fired boilers and triple expansion engines. The tribals swapped to oil fuel and steam turbines, often argued as another part of Jackie Fisher's need for speed. This did allow for a speed of 33 knots on 12,500 shaft horsepower, which for 1905 was very fast. Unfortunately for the British, that speed came with consequences, namely a very short operational range. It varied between ships, with Friedman citing an average of around 1,600 to 1,700 miles at 15 knots, with an outlier in HMS Nubian of 2,250 miles. This would play a key role in the ship's service later on. Weaponry also varied due to the large change in design between the tribal groups. Zulu and Nubian, as part of the last group, had two 4-inch guns, one on the bow and one on the stern, along with two single 18-inch torpedo tubes and later on depth charges. All of this came out to a ship displacing around 950 to 1,000 tons. It again varied between ships, not least because different dockyards built the ships in slightly different ways, even if they held to a core design. For this video, the relevant ones are Nubian and Zulu. HMS Nubian was built by Thornycroft, with the ship launched on April 20th, 1909. Friedman cites a displacement of 985 tons. HMS Zulu, meanwhile, was built by Hawthorne, launching on September 16th, 1909, at a displacement of 1,033 tons. Both ships had been laid down in 1908, May 18th for Nubian and August 18th for Zulu. Their service histories were, for the most part, pretty similar to each other. Both destroyers spent their peacetime service mostly on training, along with the odd naval review. I'll probably cover their careers in more detail in dedicated videos. For the moment, Nothing terribly surprising to their service, until we reach the middle of 1914. With the Great War kicking off at the end of July, things would change. Both destroyers primarily served on the Dover Patrol, which included the tribals, as their short range consigned them to secondary duty. The Dover Patrol would become very important as the war ground on, catching German raiders and submarines while supporting the land war. However, it didn't have the same fame as the North Sea battles. From 1914 to 1916, Nubian and Zulu had fairly typical careers for this area. Things really changed for these two ships in late 1916. First, let's look at Nubian. She was present for the Battle of Dover Strait on October 26, 1916. This was an engagement between British destroyers and German torpedo boats, with 6 of the tribals involved in this battle, including Nubian. In the darkness of night, Nubian mistook the Germans for British ships. She got too close and took a torpedo to the bow, while trying to ram one of the German ships. This didn't sever the bow, but it did cause severe damage, something that caused issues when Nubian was under tow to dock. The ship broke her line in bad weather and ran hard aground near Dover. Nubian was stuck ashore with the destroyer's damaged bow splitting off, leading to the bow and the stern ending up under a cliff. Throughout all of this, she lost 15 of her crew. Meanwhile, Zulu would suffer her own damage. On November 8, 1916, she struck a mine laid by a German submarine. This exploded beneath the engine room and severed the ship's stern. 3 of the crew were lost, while Zulu was towed to France by a French destroyer. At this point, both ships would probably have been scrapped. They certainly weren't going to be repaired quickly, if they could be repaired at all. However, the British needed every ship they could get. And as I said at the start, someone took a look at Nubian and Zulu, a destroyer without a bow and a destroyer without a stern. Why not weld the two together to get one functional destroyer? So Zulu was towed home, and Nubian was blasted free from the rocks. And both ships were put in dock at Chatham for the rebuild, a rebuild that began in January 1917. This is not to say it was an easy process. Remember how each tribal differed from the others based on the shipyard? That meant no two ships were exactly the same, even though the British sectioned the ships off to try and fit them together. It would not be a perfect match, because the ships were built by different yards to slightly different designs. This would result in a difference in beam of 3.5 inches or 89 millimeters where the ships were merged, which doesn't seem like much, but you really don't want any gaps in a ship's hull. In spite of that difference, the British managed to successfully weld the wrecks together, in both body and name, because the resulting ship, still a tribal class, was renamed, not Nubian and not Zulu. Instead, she returned to service on June 7, 1917, as HMS Zubian, a fusion of the names to match the fusion of the ships. It even works when you consider that Zulu's bow was grafted to Nubian's stern. Of course, it confused the Germans when a new tribal showed up with such a weird name. I'm not sure if they ever figured out the truth, at least during the war. To them, it was a new ship of an old design, with a name that made no sense. In any event, Zubian came out mostly similar to her donor ships. She was still a tribal, but the ship lost 5 feet in length during her rebuild, a result of needing to fit 2 different halves together since the damage on the 2 ships wasn't identical, on top of the difference in beam. The new length of 280 feet compared to 285 was matched by a new displacement, around 1,040 tons. Zubian also gained 2 new quick-firing 4-inch guns, while the torpedoes remained the same, as did the speed, still coming out to 33 knots. With all this work concluded, Zubian returned to the Dover Patrol. However, as you might have noticed, there wasn't much of the war left. She rejoined the fleet on June 7, 1917, a year and a half, more or less, until the end of the war. Moreover, her service was broadly the same as Nubian and Zulu. Zubian spent her time patrolling the Dover Strait, hunting for German ships. However, this would largely come to nothing, at least for Zubian. She never caught any German surface raiders. Not that this is terribly surprising at this late stage of the war. On the other hand, Zubian is credited with sinking a German U-boat, the mine-laying submarine UC-50, which was sighted on the surface on February 4th of 1918, only 400 yards, 370 meters, off Zubian's bow. The British destroyer promptly attempted a ram in the fine tradition of HMS Dreadnought and RMS Olympic. However, that would fail. UC-50 submerged, causing Zubian to miss the ram. Not that this would stop the British. Instead of ramming, Zubian swapped to depth charges. This reportedly led to a large amount of oil and wreckage coming to the surface. There's been some argument in recent years that Zubian actually depth charged UC-79 and failed to sink the submarine. So bear that in mind. Maybe Zubian sank UC-50, or maybe she failed to sink UC-79. After this, her second and final notable action came in April of 1918, specifically the night of April 23rd. Zubian joined with forces assigned to the 1st Ostend raid. This was part of a larger operation to blockade the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge by sinking block ships in their channels. Zubian, for her part, provided escort for a group of monitors. These ships were acting as a bombardment force in support of the operation, and Zubian stuck close, leading to her having little to do, and the Ostend portion of the operation ended in failure, as the block ships ran aground early. For the rest of the war, Zubian returned to patrol duty, with no moments of excitement as the conflict came to its end. So Zubian lived a fairly quiet life, as it turned out. However, quiet does not mean sitting in port. Zubian had spent her time in service on patrol, wearing out her machinery. Machinery already worn out from her time as Nubian and Zulu. It should be little surprise that Zubian was decommissioned soon after the war ended, and scrapped in December 1919. She may not have had the most exciting life, but Zubian remains a triumph of engineering. Not unique, but certainly a shining example of what engineers can do when given the proper motivation. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.